Wait, what? You're feeling a little bit off? Oh yeah, you're ready for your first tune-up after break-in. Don't worry about it, we'll get you all sorted out. Hey guys, if you recently picked up a new BMX bike and you've been riding it for a little while, you may be noticing that a few things aren't quite perfect anymore. I got this Monza 24-inch BMX bike a couple of months ago, and I've been having a lot of fun riding it around the neighborhood and a ton of fun riding it up at the pump track, and it's just starting to need a little bit of attention. And so today I'm going to walk you through the process of dialing in your new BMX bike. To start with, we'll be focusing on a few key areas, and that's getting the brakes dialed in. We're going to check for any loose bolts and make sure that none of the parts have started to come loose. We'll talk about getting the seat at the right height for your riding style, talk about if you need to adjust the angle of your handlebars, getting your chain tension right, and inflating your tires. And one of the things that I've noticed through the years is that not everybody has the same skill level when it comes to mechanical things or working on bikes. Some guys, it just comes intuitive. They can just look at it and understand how it works.
Hi, Tim the Tool Man Taylor.
And other people need somebody to kind of demonstrate, or they just need to see it kind of in action before they tackle the adjustment themselves. So with that in mind, I'll be breaking this video up into chapters. So if there's any topics that you're already comfortable with or you don't care about, then feel free to skip around to see the things that you might be interested in. And so with that, let's get started. We're going to be focusing most of our attention in this video here on this Monza 24-inch BMX bike, but I do have a 20-inch flatland freestyle bike that's an S&M Dagger, and I've got a 26-inch GT Performer cruiser bike, and they have just some slightly different components. So as we go through the different steps, I might bring those bikes in just to kind of point out some differences in case you don't have a bike just like this. Even if everything else is still sound on your bike, you'll most likely need to dial in your brakes after your first few rides. And that's because brake cables often stretch after their initial use. And when that happens, you'll need to pull the levers in further and further to make good contact with the rims, and you'll lose some of your stopping power. And so you'll likely need to adjust them. And if you look here, in my case here, my front brake, I need to pull it almost all the way up to the handle grip before I get a good stopping power. And we really don't want that. Adjusting the brakes might be a little bit different depending on the braking system that you have, but they all follow the same basic principles. The three most common brake types that you'll see on BMX bikes are U-brakes, V-brakes, and side-pull caliper brakes. The Monza bikes typically have an old school side-pull caliper brake up front and a more modern V-brake in the back. The side-pull are what we remember as kids back in the day, and these were common on the front and rear of pretty much all bikes. And then sometime around the 90s, the V-brakes came into popularity. They've got quite a bit more stopping power than the side pulls. Freestyle bikes tend to have what they call a U-brake, and those have quite a bit more stopping power than the old school caliper brakes, but they are more compact and they're less susceptible to damage than the V-brakes are. The length of cable that's outside the brake housing is going to have a big impact on how tight the brakes are. The more a cable that's outside, the more distance the levers are going to be, and they're going to have a little bit less responsiveness and less power. And the shorter that distance, the brakes are going to be a little bit tighter and more responsive. So when the bike is new and still getting settled in, the easiest thing you can do to adjust the brakes is kind of mess around with these barrel adjusters up on the levers. And in some cases, like these caliper brakes, they've got one down on the brake arm as well. And so you can see here to start with, my front brake is stretched out quite a bit, and I can almost pull the lever to the grip, and that's not good. And as I've been riding this over the last couple of weeks, basically you can just twist out these barrel adjusters, and that's essentially lengthening the amount of housing compared to the cable itself, and that's going to make things quite a bit tighter. So as I pull this out or twist it out, it's tightening up. I'm not having to pull quite as far. And on these caliper brakes, they've got one on the brake arm too that you can adjust. And so that's how I've had these, getting them still responsive as I've been riding up at the pump track the last couple of weeks. But in some cases, you can only twist these out so far before they stop being effective. And essentially, you really want to use these as kind of fine-tune adjustments, especially when you're out on the road and on the fly. They shouldn't be your final permanent adjustments. So to get those, we're going to have to move down to the brake arms. So when you're working with the brake arms, it's best to get the barrel adjusters pretty much all the way to the back end. It might be good to leave them out like a turn or two. That way, if for some reason you got them a little bit too tight down at the brake arm, you can loosen some of that tension up here on the barrel adjuster. So that's how I'm going to leave this front one. Okay, it's a little bit hard to see with the black on black with the brake shoe here, but I've got a bit of distance on each side, and I'm going to want to crank these in a little bit. And so I've got a 4mm Allen key on the back, and then over here on the other side is a 8mm bolt, and I'm just going to pop that loose. Okay, so I have the brake cable completely loose here now, and I've got a lot of play in the brake arms. And so what you want to do is basically get your brake pads up against the rim and then pull this cable tight and then clamp it down. That's really hard to do with one hand in both cases. If you have someone to help you, one person to kind of hold it tight, and then you can pull down and tighten that. They make a tool called a fourth hand that a lot of bike shops will use. But in my case, I found that using an old shoestring to kind of pull them together works pretty well. So that's what I'm going to do here. Just kind of wrap it around a couple times so it'll keep the tension. Just pull that around so it doesn't come loose. All right, so those pads are pretty tight up against the rim. So I want to get my 4mm Allen on this side and my 8mm wrench on this side. I'm going to pull the slack out of the cable. Okay, that's tight. All right, so we can take off the shoestring and see how we did. All right. That is actually about perfect. I've got my barrel adjuster pretty much all the way in, and I've got some good distance there, and that will give me plenty of room to pull those out further over time if I need to make them even tighter. So front brake is good. And then moving to the rear brakes on this Monza, it comes with Diacomp MX2 V brakes, and they are way easier to work on than the caliper brakes up front. You don't need any special tools or shoestring hacks or anything like that. And it's pretty easy to adjust the amount of slack or how much extra cable you have out of the housing by just adjusting this bolt here. This is a 5mm, so you can loosen that and then pull this till you get the brakes pretty tight against the rims. For this one, you might want to leave the barrel adjuster up front out just a little bit. That way, if you get them too tight, you can loosen that up pretty easily. But the V-brakes are really easy to work on. And then with the U-brakes, there's a couple different places to adjust them. For the rear ones, you've got this kind of loop that connects the two arms together, and you can shorten that loop and effectively tightening the brake at this bolt right here, or where the loop connects to the main brake line. This bolt here can adjust, and you can pull some of the slack out that way. So that's pretty straightforward. And then up on the front, it's a little bit different. This is the exact same brake that's in the rear, but for the front, you can buy an adapter. So you can have the cable come down through the stem and come out, and then you hook that adapter up and come all the way across. And in that case, you will tighten the cable with that bolt there to get the appropriate tension. And then this bike has all kind of micro adjustments you can do on the gyro here, even all the way up to this one here. And so I'm not going to go into that in this video, but if you are interested in how the gyro setup works, let me know and I could make a video on that too. So in addition to getting the brake tightness kind of appropriate with the levers, a couple other things you might want to double check are your brake shoes still in line with the rims? You don't want to have them up too high towards the tire or too down towards the bottom of the rim. You want to have a good full contact. You want to have it kind of parallel to the rim itself. So you double check those in case something slipped over time. And then after that, it's good to check and make sure that the brake shoes themselves are kind of centered and have an equal amount of space on each side. That's going to be a little bit harder to check here with this camera here. But basically the amount of space here and the amount of space over here should be pretty equal. And in the case of V-brakes, you're going to want to have them pretty equal on each side. If you find that one side of the V-brake is too far out, what you can do is there's some screws here on the edge here, and when you screw these in, you're going to be increasing the amount of pressure on that spring, and it's going to want to pull it this way. So if you tighten this in, it's going to pull it out. And the same way on this side, if you tighten this one in, it's going to pull it out. So it's a little bit of trial and error to get kind of the right tension on each side. But as you do that, these will kind of, you can kind of home in on the center point and you'll be good to go. Okay, so up here on the front, you want to also make sure that the brake pads are kind of have an equal amount of space, and that when you pull the brake levers themselves, that it's not all going on one side. And there's a couple ways you can do that. The easiest thing you can do is buy this park tool, get it on Amazon or wherever. It's just a few bucks. But what you can do with it is it can hook below these wires here in the back, the springs, and you can hold those arms still and on the back, and then you can make some adjustment and kind of just get that whole pivot just at the right angle so that when you pull, there is an equal distance. So that's pretty easy. It's a cheap tool. The other thing you can do is pop this cap off, use a 10 millimeter on the front, in the back, and then a real narrow one on the front. There's going to be 2 bolts or nuts here. And depending on which direction you're going, if you're going to the right, you'll use the one on the back. And then if you're going to the left, you'll use the one on the front. And so you can have, your screw in the back, and then you can pivot them like that. If you want to see a video on that, I can make one, but for the sake of time, we'll just leave it at that. Oh yeah, there's one more thing with the brake pads you might want to consider. Let me set the camera down here. Is if you're getting screechy, like squealing and screechy brakes, that's most often the case is because your brake pad is vibrating as it hits the rim. In this case with these plastic mags, it's really not a problem on these. But if you had metal rims and they're screeching, one thing you can do is what's called toe in, and you want the very front of the brake pad to hit just ever so slightly before the rear does. And so with these V-brakes here, the brake pads, the system makes it really easy to tilt these in all different directions. A common thing is to take a rubber band and wrap it around the back and then push everything down, and then you pull the rubber band off, and that gave you just the right amount of gap. Maybe you could use a credit card or whatever, but you're looking just for a very minor gap in the back compared to the front when it first makes contact. And that will eliminate the vibrations and the squealing. You don't need to worry about that if your brakes aren't making those noise, but if they're not settling in and they keep on being screechy, that's most likely your best solution. In the front, if you're having that happen and you've got these old school caliper brakes, these brake shoes don't have that same type of adjustment. And what you can do is take, I don't have 2 crescent wrenches with me, but you'll want to take 2 crescent wrenches like this, and you'll put one on each side. You'll tighten it down, and you can actually bend them. So you'll want to do it even pressure on both sides, but you can bend it ever so slightly, and then that will cause the front shoe to hit just a little bit before the rear does. Okay, the last thing with the brakes, and then we'll move on, are the angles of the brake levers. And basically this is a lot of preference, but make sure that they're not down too vertical, pointing down, or they're not too flat, pointing out. A good rule of thumb is 45 degrees as a good starting point. And the reason you don't want them out of that kind of alignment is if they're up too high, it's going to force your elbows down as you're riding and give you kind of an awkward steering position, or you're going to have to like adjust your hand every time you want to like reach up to grab. And then similarly down on the bottom, if they're too far down, you're going to be reaching forward to get a good grip. And so you want them kind of at that 45-degree angle. They just follow your arm kind of naturally down in plane, and so your hands are just kind of right in position to pull, and you're not having to readjust when you're trying to pull tension on the levers. Let's move on to tightening parts and making sure that everything is still tight and secure. Your first few rides can cause a few things to loosen up here and there, so it's always good to double check that. In our case here, we've already checked the brake system, so we know everything's safe and sound there. One thing that can happen is your headset can kind of loosen up, and a way to check that is if you turn your handlebar 90 degrees and hold down the front brake, and with the bike on the ground, give it kind of a rock back and forth. And if you hear any noise or feel any shaking or rocking down here, then you know that the headset is a little bit loose. And to fix that, you can loosen these 2 bolts that hold the stem onto the fork. And then here up on the top is a compression bolt with a cap on it. And you can tighten that down, and that will snug everything up. You just don't want to pull it too tight, otherwise it'll add too much friction and make the steering not as smooth. And then once you get that back, then you can retighten those bolts and just do them a little bit on each side so you've got an even pressure down through the stem. And then likewise up on the cap that holds the handlebars on, you want to double check and make sure that those are all still tight too. I've done that recently, so I know I'm good to go there. And then next up, you want to double check the tightness of the nuts that hold the wheel on. And in this case, I've got a 15 millimeter socket here. And so you can just kind of give them a little bit of torque. And if you feel any movement there, then obviously you're happy that you got them retightened. So that's good there. And in my case here, I know that my cranks are a little bit loose. I could feel and hear a little bit of a rocking, kind of a creaking sound down there. And I checked in this, the bolt here was indeed a little bit loose. So I'm gonna actually pull the cranks off and put some grease on the spindle, and that will help with any creaking sound. And then I'm gonna put some Loctite on the bolt that holds that in. But to do that, I'm gonna need to loosen the rear wheel so I can get the chain off. So then I got the wheel forward, so all I need to do is just kind of pull this chain off to the side and let it go forward, and it'll fall right off. So these are 3-piece cranks, but not all cranks are the same. In this case, these attach with more of a kind of a pressure on the spindle, kind of like old school mountain bike cranks did. Some of the more premium lines, like the Redline Flights or some of the profiles, they'll have a pinch bolt here, and when you release the pinch and take this bolt out, they'll just pop right off. But in this case, we need a crank pulling tool that will kind of push pressure in and just kind of pull it off. So that's what we're going to do here. We will screw this in first. And so we want to tighten this. All right, so we've got the crank off. So I've got some grease here, and we're going to put a little bit of that on the spindle, and that will help with some of the rock creaking sound in the future. And then I've got some Loctite that we're going to put on the bolt here to make sure that that stays in safe and sound. Just kind of getting it around. You don't want to get it inside the threads there. And you want to make sure that the crank arm is opposite of the one that's installed on the other side. All right, so I've got this Loctite, the blue thread locker. This is the 242, the medium strength. And you can get this on Amazon. It's cheap. It's just a few bucks. But yeah, you just want to put a couple of drops on here where the thread is going to engage. You don't need much at all. So we're going to put that back on. And then as we tighten this, it will push the pressure back down onto that tapered part of the spindle. And we want to get it good and tight. All right, so then we're going to put the chain back on the sprocket here. We'll kind of roll it forward. I'm going to go ahead and get the other crank greased up and the Loctite, and then I'll come back and get the rear wheel reattached. The nice thing about this grease in particular is that it's clear. All right, that's good. Now we can pull the rear wheel back and get the tension back in the chain. So to do that, basically you just want to pull it tight. Pull it all the way back so that you have some good tension there. You can finger tighten the nuts on each side, and we're going to kind of pull and tighten at the same time. That'll get some decent tension on the chain over here. So we'll lock that side down. Then we'll come back on the other side. And over here in the wheel, you just want to make sure that it's still centered. And if it's not, you can kind of push or pull as you tighten the other side. In my case, it's still perfectly aligned. I've got that side, and then I'll come up and snug this side again. And we are good to go. All right, anytime you make any adjustments to the wheel back here, it's always a good idea to double check to make sure that your brake pads are still in alignment. In my case, everything still looks pretty good. I'm not getting any rubbing or anything, so I think I'm good to go here. Next up, we have seat height, and there's really no one size fits all rule here. In this case, I've got a 26-inch GT Performer, and this is a cruiser bike that I use to ride more casually around the neighborhoods. And in that case, I'm sitting down most of the time, and so a higher seat is going to be more comfortable. And also for efficiency, when you're pedaling, the less angled your knee is at that full stroke, the more efficient and full power you're going to get from each pedal. And if the seat was down a little bit lower, your knees are going to be more compressed and you're just not going to get as efficient of a pedaling experience. So in my case, I keep the seat up pretty high on this cruiser bike. And then for the traditional BMX bikes, these bikes aren't really meant to go or ride super long distances, so you don't need to worry about the seat at a comfortable level for those long enduring rides. And in this case, the seats are typically quite a bit lower. You want them lower so that you can get your center of gravity low when you're navigating turns and berms on the pump track or the race course, or when you're doing tricks, you don't want the seat in the way, or even when you're landing jumps, you want it a bit lower so that you have room to compress with your knees. And in this case, I've got a 20-inch S&M Dagger bike that's set up more as a flatland freestyle bike. And this frame in particular has a really low standover height of the top tube. And so a more traditional bike, BMX bike, this might be up at a higher angle. And the seat looks like it's up high, but in this case, it really isn't that high. Considering when I stand over, and especially when I'm up on the pedals, I've got quite a bit of room here. But yeah, traditional BMX bikes, you want that seat quite a bit lower. And back to the 24-inch Monza here, I tend to keep its seat a little bit more on the in-between level. It's low enough that when I'm at the pump track and being a little more aggressive and taking sharper turns, that it gets out of the way. I can still get my center of gravity low and kind of get my weight a little bit back further to make the sharper turns. But it's high enough up that when I'm kind of cruising around the block that it's still relatively comfortable. So that's kind of how I like this bike. The next thing you might want to consider adjusting is the angle of your handlebars up front. And depending on who set up the bike, whether it was you or someone else, they may already be in a great position. But generally the rule of thumb is you want to have the handlebar angle to be pretty much parallel with the angle of the forks up front. That's a good starting point, and then from there you can move them forward a little bit or backwards a little bit from there. If you remember back in the day, there would be kids who would move their handlebars kind of far forward, and they called that Chicago style. And that's really not good for the handling of the bike. It's going to get your center of balance too far forward and make things feel a little bit wonky. And so if you feel the need to do that today, then chances are your bike is a little bit too small and you'll want to have a frame that has a little bit of a longer top tube to give you a little bit more space up there. And the opposite is true, that if you feel like you have to pull your handlebars back for it to be comfortable, then again, that's going to mess up the steering and make it feel really wonky. And in that case, your bike is too big, and it'd be better to have a bike with a shorter top tube to kind of pull everything closer to you so you can still have the handlebars in the correct position. And oh yeah, it's worth mentioning that when you're adjusting your handlebars, whether you have a top load stem or a front load stem like my GT, they'll have 4 bolts on here, and you'll want to tighten them very evenly a little bit at a time, and you'll want to go in a crisscross pattern to ensure that you have even pressure as you're tightening the cap back down onto the handlebars. And then finally, we've got the tire pressure, and it seems like a no-brainer, like why would I even bring this up in this video? But I can't tell you how many times through the years that I've grabbed one of my bikes to go off on a ride and got a little ways from the house and realized, man, the bike feels a little sluggish, what's up? And realizing, oh crap, I should have added air to the tires. And so you definitely want to double check that. And the thing is, there's no one correct tire pressure for all of your bikes. It kind of just depends on what the bike is. In this case, this Monza has these Kenda Comp 3 tires, and they have a lower PSI at 40. The GT Performer that I have, the 26-inch cruiser, it has these GT LP5 Heritage tires, and those have a maximum PSI of 60. And then over on that 20-inch S&M Dagger that I've got, it's got S&M Speedball tires, and those are rated at actually 110 PSI. So you definitely want to pay attention to what the maximum rating is on your tire and then inflate those properly. Well, there you have it. Our Monza 24-inch is now dialed in and ready to go. Oh, you're welcome. Remember that these adjustments aren't just for this Monza bike here. They can be applied to pretty much any BMX bike. And I'm curious with you guys, did I miss anything? Are there any tips and tricks that you guys like to do when you're setting up a new bike after you kind of got it settled in? I'd love to hear those down in the comments below. As always, thanks for joining us here on the Nostalgic Neighborhood. Keep riding, keep exploring, and we'll see you in the next video.